Hello. This week we're going to talk about persuasion, and it's the final week of our class. Amazing how time flies, huh? So first we're going to talk about what we have to do this week. Then I'm going to get into discussing persuasion with you all for a little bit. This week we have a few things to do. Of course, the biggest is the persuasive speech. It's actually more points than the final exam. And don't forget that you have to also upload the outline for the persuasive speech in that assignment. And then you have the final exam, which pretty much covers every chapter I have assigned reading for the last several weeks. So you might want to go back and do a little bit of rereading. I believe it's 20 questions worth 100 points, but I took a couple questions from each chapter and put them in there. And then there's one discussion talking about reflections, and that will be the end of our week and the end of our class. So there is no CI this week either. So let's talk about persuasive speeches. Let's talk about persuasion in general. Persuasion is the most common form of communication we engage in. So what do these statements have in common? I would like a raise. Should we eat Italian tonight? Will you marry me? All three of those are a form of persuasive speech. And so persuasion is speech where you're trying to get people to perform an action that we want them to do, or to change their attitudes, values, and beliefs in our favor. You could persuade someone to do something that's harmful to you, but I don't know why you would do that. So if you look at the root word persuasion and look at the definition of the word, the root word of persuasion is suasory, to move. The prefix per means in your favor. So the word persuasion literally means to move someone in your favor. And persuasion really came into prominence as a detailed form of communication way back in ancient Greece and Athens. In Aristotle, back at the time when the city-state of Athens was created, that they had a king, and then they decided the king wasn't so hot, so they killed the king, which wasn't uncommon. But they didn't have a successor. Usually a king has an heir, and that person takes over. So the king who they killed has no heir, and they came up with this radical concept for the time that they will rule themselves, which had never been tried before in the history of the world up to that point. And there was no playbook on how to do it. So they decided to take all of the things that the king was in charge of, all of the lands that he owned, all of the resources he provided, all of the things that he oversaw, the military, etc., and divvy it up among people. So they created the court of Athens, and people would come in and argue that they should be given control of this one particular public sector of the city-state. So for instance, the king owned olive tree fields. He had several of them. They would put one of the fields up for auction, so to speak, and people would have to come in and persuade them that they were better they were the best choice to run that olive field. So up to that point, persuasion was researched and looked at, and when you talk about Athens, you're talking about the three great scholars of Western civilization, which is Socrates, who begat Plato, who begat Aristotle. So three successful teachers, starting with Socrates. He was the first teacher. His student was Plato. Plato had a student named Aristotle. Together, those three philosophers are considered the foundation of Western philosophy and civilization and rhetoric. And so there became a time where, okay, we had, the common person, not just the elite. So at this point, only the elite are being educated in Athens. But the common person needed to learn how to be persuasive, because if you want to get ahead in the world, you got to hustle. And to hustle, you got to be able to talk. And so all these people realized they needed to learn to be persuasive so that they can be successful. So they went out and hired these teachers, and these teachers are like speech coaches, and they're called sophists. And these sophists were very similar to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, except that they weren't Athenian. They were kind of like just professional rhetoricians, and they would teach people how to speak well. And Plato writes about this a lot in his writings, and it really upsets him because for the three, Socrates, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the definition of rhetoric and public speaking is a good person speaking well. And for them, that means speaking on the betterment of Athens, that everything they did was to make Athens a better place. That was their definition of what was good rhetoric. And these sophists weren't Athenian. They're from all over the Mediterranean. And they didn't really care about Athens. They just wanted to make money. And so they would just teach their students how to win an argument. And in one of one of Plato's famous letters, he talks about the fact that a small area just outside the main town of Athens needed a doctor. And two people applied for the job. One who was well qualified and probably had, all the appropriate medical training for that time to be a doctor. And the other person had no medical training whatsoever, but he had hired a sophist to teach him how to speak well. And they gave the job of town doctor to someone who had no medical experience. And Plato really just hated that for obvious reasons. So that's really where rhetoric and persuasion starts to get its start. I mean, the definition of rhetoric, I told you the definition of persuasion. Definition of rhetoric is persuasion by any and all means possible. Now, Aristotle and his masters, Plato and Socrates, they thought that all means possible meant all good means. The world's evolved past that. And so you can look today at modern day memes, which are a form of persuasive speech, and they're not anywhere close to being true. Their goal, is to get you to buy into whatever attitude, value, or belief they're selling, and then, get you to see things in the way they want you to see them. So that's where persuasion starts, and then it moves to Rome, because Rome comes in and conquers Athens. And what Rome does is make everything better. And there was a scholar in Rome called Cicero. And Cicero develops what's called the 5 Canons of Rhetoric. It's basically the first handbook for giving a speech. Here are the 5 things you have to cover. And so if you were to break it down, it's not that dissimilar to what I teach today. It's just organized a little bit differently. So Cicero was a senator in Rome, and he was called the Gadfly of Rome because he was always a critic and criticizing the Roman government. And the Ides of March come, and Julius Caesar is killed. And if any of you have read the Julius Caesar play by Shakespeare, there is a Cicero character in there, but Cicero is a common name. It's not the same Cicero. So Julius Caesar's killed. Mark Antony and Caesar Augustus take over. It's a lot of turmoil. And they decided that the last thing they needed was someone questioning their actions and motives. So they call Cicero to their estate. Say, hey, Cicero, come on, let's talk about what's going to happen. And they kill Cicero. They kill him because they don't need him criticizing every action that they make. They don't only kill him, they quarter his body and send it to the 4 corners of the Roman Empire, which is as far south as Egypt, as far north as England, into what we would consider the Russian Eastern Europe border at this time. So Rome is a pretty big empire. And they take his head and they put it on a spear in the Roman Senate. So the next day, the Roman senators come to work and they see Cicero's head, their friend, his head on a spear. Now, anything that Mark Antony and Caesar Augustus are going to propose, what do you think the senators are going to do? Are they going to say yes or no? They're totally going to say yes. So That's where this notion that persuasion and speaking out becomes, there's a danger to it. There's an inherent risk to it. And that has always been true of people who speak out. And so at that point, rhetoric and persuasion moves sort of subversive and into art and poetry and plays. Shakespeare, talking about Shakespeare again, Hamlet does not confront his stepfather / uncle about the death of his father directly. He writes a play. And so in the face of the fact that direct confrontation, direct persuasion could be harmful, it moves into art, it moves into literature, it moves into metaphors and similes so that it's not such a open attack. And rhetoric kind of stays there really for the next, I'm going to say 1,000 years, 1,1300 years. It's not until the finding of America and the settling of America and all the rhetoric that goes around that with the speeches against England's rule of the colonists and the colonists arguing for what kind of government we should have, really brings public discourse and persuasion back to, and rhetoric back to the limelight and its heyday. So once Cicero dies in Rome, and we're talking roughly 37 AD, there's no real resurgence of it until the 1700s in what's now the United States of America. So that's sort of the quick history of persuasion, but there's things we can learn from that. So persuasion, there's things you need to do to persuade, and Aristotle did the work with what he's called the three proofs. And Aristotle was a unique human being. He's one of those human beings who comes around at a moment of time, and they are just so gifted in so many different things. And so I would say people like Aristotle, Leonardo da Vinci, Benjamin Franklin, they had this thing about them that they were just uber smart in so many different ways. And not just being a philosopher and being a rhetorician, Aristotle was also a scientist. So he always wanted to look at things from the scientific method. So he sort of was there on the ground floor developing the rhetorical method, the critical method, and also the scientific method at the same time. A lot of the ways that biology classifies class, genus, and family of animals comes from Aristotle. So Aristotle wanted to know what makes for an effective persuasive speech. And he says you have to have three things. These are called his three proofs. In order to prove something and be successful to your audience in persuasion, you need these three things: ethos, pathos, and logos. And so ethos is ethics. And so what he talks about is you need credibility. You need to be a good person speaking well. And by that he means you have to have good intentions, or at least the audience has to perceive you have good intentions. They have to perceive you to be a good person. And you have to have a good reason for persuading them and use good evidence. And so he talks about the fact that all these come into play to creating your credibility. And credibility is one of the leading factors in a persuasive speech. Who we listen to, a lot has to do with credibility, way more so than evidence. If you trust somebody, and if you think along the same ideological lines of them, they need to do far less to convince you to do something than someone else. So he talks about that being the first thing: ethos, ethics. You have to give your audience a credible speech. You have to be seen as a credible person. You have to use credible information, and it goes a long way to persuading people. The second thing he talks about is pathos, emotion. You have to, in order for an audience to act on something, you have to make them care about it. It has to be something that's relevant to them. And so if it's not something that directly affects somebody, if it's not something they're going to care about, usually your audience will be slow to react. And so you either have to point out the inherent connection between your topic and your audience so that they know to care, or you have to create that connection yourself. And so, for instance, if someone's going to come and talk to me about, let's say, a trash strike in Cincinnati. Now, I'll feel sad for the people in Cincinnati, but you know what? I don't live in Cincinnati. I've never been to Cincinnati. I don't have any relatives that I know of who live in Cincinnati. I care very little about what happens in Cincinnati. I would care much more if there was a trash strike in Los Angeles. So, if your topic is not something that your audience can readily see their emotional connection to it or why they should care about it, then you need to create that for them. You need to explain to them why this is important and why it's relevant to you and why you should care about this. And so he says that's the second thing you need. You need to create an emotional connection, or at least expose the emotional connection between your audience and the topic. And the third thing is logos, which is basically evidence. He says you need evidence to convince people, but it's not always the evidence that's the most persuasive. He talks about the fact that ethos and pathos often do way farther in convincing people in persuasion than evidence. A lot of times people will ignore evidence, even to their detriment. The most famous trial in Los Angeles history, the O.J. Simpson trial. There was more evidence to convict O.J. Simpson of murder than 99.999999999% of every person who's ever convicted of murder. And in fact, if CSI was a television show when the O.J. Simpson murder happened, it would have been about a 2-day trial. But the fact that DNA was so new and no one understood it, the DNA evidence suggested that the chances of someone other than O.J. Simpson committing that crime was something like 7 billion to 1. Which was, at that time, just about twice the population of the Earth, which makes it a scientifically insignificant deviation, or it makes it a scientifically statistical fact that there could have been no other person but O.J. Simpson who committed those crimes. And yet the jury dismissed it. They didn't even care about it. That's called jury nullification. The evidence, they chose to ignore that evidence. So he says you have to have evidence in most cases, but that sometimes people will just ignore that evidence. So he says it's strong, but it's not the strongest proof. So he says you have to have a combination of all three of these things in your speech to do well. You have to be seen as a good person, speaking for a good reason. You have to explain the emotional connection of why we should care about this or why it's important for us. And you have to present evidence that will help us understand, which is going to lead me into talking about our speech specifically. So we talked about organizational patterns early on in this class, and I mentioned problem, cause, solution in that lecture, but didn't really talk about it a lot. So just to review, we have spatial, chronological, topical. Those are ways you organize informative and other types of speeches by space, by time, or by importance. Well, persuasion has its own organizational pattern, and there's two. One's called Monroe's motivated sequence, which I'm not really going to cover in the class here because it's just so different than everything else. Not that it's bad, it's just I'm focused on problem, cause, solution. So the second one, which I'm going to talk more about, is problem, cause, solution, and it says just that. So in the three main points of your speech, you have the first main point is you have to convince us there is a problem. The second one is you have to tell us what the cause of that problem is, and in the third point, you need to make a solution. You have to propose a solution. Let's go back. Let's break each one of those down. So in the first main point, problem. It's not enough to tell us that there is a problem. You have to prove to us that there is a problem. Let's take the case of global warming, or more accurately, climate change. You have to present evidence that the climate is changing. And you could use anecdotal data that shows weather patterns in the Arctic or anywhere and say, okay, it's changing. LA, where we live, is a lot more drier than it used to be. We weren't always, so parched for rain. In fact, it's only recently in the last 30 or 40 years that our rain patterns have shifted. So first and foremost, you have to prove there's a problem. You have to convince your audience, because if there's no problem, the audience isn't going to care about the rest of your speech. And so you would need a source or two to convince us that this is a problem. Here is the problem I'm explaining to you. The climate patterns in the world are changing. Here is my evidence. So think of it as a CI. Let's put this in the CI format, because this is the way I want you to present your information and your main points. The climates are changing around the world. That's the statement. The explanation of that is we can look to the the Arctic circles. We can look to our own region. We can see data and weather patterns that show that climate patterns are changing. And then that's the evidence. Explain this. So what does this mean? Okay, it means basically, as you can tell, I'm doing this on the fly. It means basically that we are seeing enough evidence that we are, people and climates are changing, and therefore it's affecting how people see things. Hang on one second. Please be quiet, doggy. My dog's getting all antsy. So basically, statement, climates are changing in the world. Come here, Nala, come on. Come on. Come on, girl. Go outside. Go outside for a little bit. I apologize. So basically, you make a statement that climate change is a real thing. Explanation that climate changing could affect the economy, the health, and even our safety around the world. So, people who, for instance, live in Colorado and live off of the ski industry, well, if it stops snowing in Colorado, that's going to drive them up economically. People who live on the coast, if climate change affects the melting of snow and raises the water level, their towns may become flooded with water. That is causing them to move and lose their homes. That would impact them. There are some islands in the South Pacific that are actually sinking in the ocean because of the melting of the polar ice caps. So that's the explanation. Now we go on to the evidence. Here is the evidence. We have 100 years of weather patterns, and we've shown in multiple locations that our weather patterns are changing and affecting that. And so interpretation, it would be like that you've lived your whole life in an air-conditioned room, and all of a sudden you were forced to now live outside in the heat with no air conditioning. It's a basic CI. But basically, you have to convince us it's a problem. That's the first step. The second step is you have to identify a significant cause to that problem. Because here's the thing. The problem is just a symptom. The cause is the real issue we have to solve. If you have a fever and you go to the doctor, your doctor's going to be concerned about your fever. But your fever isn't the problem. Your fever isn't the issue. It's a symptom. Same thing with the cause. That your doctor's got to find out what's causing your infection, that's causing the problem of your fever, in order to solve it. And that's very similar to a persuasive speech. You can't just say, here's a problem. You have to identify the cause. And scientists on both sides of the climate change argument don't argue the climate's changing. Where they really argue is what is the cause. On one side, you have people saying that it's human beings and our impact that is causing this. And you have another side that's saying we are insignificant to the ecosystem of the Earth, and it's just a natural cycle and rotation. And the Earth has gone through climate change its whole entire history. And so that's where they're stuck up in that issue. This is a very important point. Our speech does not solve the problem, it solves the cause. So when we get to the next step in a minute, the solution, your solution has to deal with solving the cause of the problem. Let me repeat that again. Your solution has to deal with solving the cause of the problem. So you have to sort of pitch your idea of here's what I think the strongest cause is for something. And then that way gives us focus. And again, you're probably going to need some evidence to point that out. And a good, effective solution needs a cause. I mean, I can think of multiple issues in America that have failed because we haven't addressed the cause. We have been in a war on drugs for 50 years now, and it's because the government's always looking at that from the problem or supply side of why are people bringing drugs into our country. They've never once stopped to look at it from the cause. What's causing people to want to risk what the demand side, what drives people to want to take drugs? And you're never going to win a war on drugs just attacking it from the supply side. It's basic economics. You take away the demand, supply dries up. And we've never ever addressed it from the demand side. You look here in Los Angeles in our county's asserted effort towards gangs. And it's always been around penalizing people for gang activities or penalizing them for being the problem. Never really looking at least on a macro level, what causes people to be attracted to this lifestyle. And so you'd have to look at things that not just, addressing it by the problem, just look at the violence that happens in gangs. Looking at it from the cost system, we have to ask ourselves what makes that life an option or a reality for people. And you have to look at what the root causes are. You look at economic instability, lack of parity in education across, there's a million different social factors that make that lifestyle appealing to some, economic opportunity. And until you address those causes, you're never going to solve that problem. So that's the second step, is you have to give us, there often is more than one cause for a problem. You just have to make a case that yours is a significant cause to it. And then the third point is your solution. And so the third main point is I have a plan to solve this. Now this is usually the most intricate of the three main points because your plan has to address what is causing the problem. It has to have a plan that actually addresses it. The second thing is there has to be an advantage for putting that plan in place. So think of it this way. We all have cable and streaming services, and we've all done that game of switching from Spectrum to Dish TV for a better deal every couple years. But what if you had, let's say, Spectrum TV, and DirecTV calls you up and says, "Hey, we got a great deal. We'd like you to switch over, blah blah blah," and you're paying $99 a month for cable right now, and DirecTV says it's only going to cost you $99. Would you change? I don't think I would. There's no advantage to it. And so in any solution, you have to explain the advantage. And what I mean by the advantage is there has to be a benefit. We have to be better off if we enact this plan and if we put this plan in place. And so you have to really explain, okay, here's my plan to solve the cause. Here's the advantage to solving the cause. And then the last part of the solution is what we call the action step. Here's what you can do to help me enact this solution. And so usually you're asking your audience for an action step. Excuse me. So if I'm giving a speech that a particular politician should be in power because I like their politics and I think their policies are going to be good for us as a community, my solution is we should vote for them. Because if we vote for them, then the advantage is they're going to enact their policies. How can you help me? I'm asking you to vote for them. The act of asking them to vote is an action step. Or I'm working to solve literacy in our society. I've created this program that is called Back to Basic Books, where we go and read in the library. I'm asking you to donate your time and read just for 1 hour a month at the local community library. That's the action step. So in every solution, there has to be something that you're asking of your audience to do. You just can't explain to us, say, oh, here's the problem, here's my solution. You have to sort of take that step of here's how we together can enact this solution. So in that nutshell, it's problem, cause, solution. Now, a lot of times in solutions, people sort of copy solutions, which is typical, and it's not bad. You can look and see and tried and true things, if you're not, or you can come up with your own unique solution. It takes a little bit of research. So that, in a nutshell, is the problem, cause, solution organizational pattern that I want you to do for your speech. Now, let's put this all together in real-world terms. Let's see if my dog's going to behave now. Are you going to behave? Come on in. Here's the scenario. We all live in the same housing area in a town, in anywhere in the United States, and we're part of a neighborhood watch homeowners association. Well, one of us, I just pick someone at random. I'm going to say Elton at random. Notices that he has graffiti on his house. So he comes to a meeting and says, hey, we got a graffiti problem. Well, here's the first thing we do. He has to convince us it's a problem. Is this a problem of the community, or is it specifically targeting Elton? Because if it's specifically targeting Elton, then that graffiti would happen anywhere that Elton lived. But then a few others of us noticed, hey, yeah, you know what? I saw graffiti not only on your garage, but I saw it on this wall over here and that over there. So now we have enough evidence to prove that it's not just happening to Elton, it's happening all around our community. What's the cause? We do a little bit of research. We reach out to the police. Let's say they have a community policing lead officer who comes and talks to us. He says, well, the type of graffiti we're seeing isn't gang graffiti. It's mostly just malicious kids. And we have been picking up a lot of malicious kids lately because of the COVID situation, and they're just not, they have so much idle time. Actually, let's not even bring the COVID into this. We've picked up a lot of kids doing basic vandalism lately. And so we know that these kids are causing this problem, or this population of kids are causing this problem. What's the solution? So we do some research, and we find that a suburb in Phoenix, Arizona, had a very similar problem, and what they did was create a midnight basketball league, and it really cut down vandalism and graffiti in their neighborhoods. So we can create a midnight basketball league. So the solution is we need to contact the city and get part-time donated. We need to get sponsors to help pay for that part-time and uniforms and trophies. So we'll reach out to our neighborhood businesses and we'll connect them, and then we'll have a midnight basketball league, which will give these kids who are creating vandalism something to do with their time. And if this suburb in Phoenix saw over a 50% reduction in graffiti, we should see the same results. The advantage of doing this is that there's a couple advantages. First, by businesses in the city working together, we're building up economic partnerships. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we are creating a sense of community by having these midnight basketball leagues. We're connecting now our youth to local businesses and our civic leaders, and creating yet another relationship there, a benefit. And so if we enact this, there's two immediate benefits. And the long-term benefit is, you can imagine, we will see less graffiti in our neighborhoods and less stuff to deal with. And that's sort of that whole problem, cause, solution put into action. So, persuasive speeches. It's the final speech. It is the single largest point value assignment in the class if you add in the outline and the speech together. Take your time. Think of a good topic. Record it, upload it, and that's why I told you last week to start thinking about persuasive topics. And make sure that you take the final exam and participate in the final discussion. And what's the last thing I want to leave you? My sort of final word of thought of persuasion is, it is the most common form of communication. It's also, without a doubt, the most important form of communication that we touch on here. So much of our life is spent trying to get people to do stuff for them, or other people trying to get us to do stuff for them. And so, or trying to get people to do stuff for us, or get other people to do stuff, get me to do something for them. So it's something you have to think about. It really helps you sort of get along. I want a raise is a form of persuasive speech. You just can't walk into your boss and say, I want a raise. If you go in there and explain the problem, I think I'm making too little money, and here's a solution. You list all these reasons why you think you deserve more money. I've worked here for so long. You've given me keys to the store. I'm allowed to make bank drops. You put a lot of responsibility on me. I feel like I deserve more money. And so that's a persuasive act in its nature. So persuasion is always an important part of speech. Remember to read the book. I hope you've had fun, and I will see you all online. Have a great day.